The other experience I'll tell you about was that of a nurse named Pablo. He was considered an odd character. He belonged to the Umbanda religion. The shifts I had with him had a high and strange mortality. When a patient is in critical condition, there are signs that foreshadow the fatal outcome. On the shifts with Pablo, the first would see him approach the very sick patients, then whisper something in their ear and step away. He would come to me and say, "I captured their soul for my saint," and afterwards he'd leave a pin under the pillow. And hours later the patient would worsen and there was nothing anyone could do. For that reason, as you can imagine, many people murmured about what Pablo was doing. So nursing management decided to investigate him and later removed him from the service. Incredibly, after they did that, the mortality dropped. Pablo was sent to a new post. He was put in charge of vaccinations but said he couldn't adapt. He resigned a few months later, and one day we found out he had taken his own life. The hospital remained the same, with some patients recovering and others dying. One night I was checking on the progress of a patient who was at the end, and suddenly the door closed. There was no one nearby, and the monitor immediately showed that the patient had died. The nurses prepared to unplug the machines when one of the nurses called me and said, "Doctor, come quickly, see this." She was nervous and very frightened. I went to the head of the bed and she lifted the pillow and showed me a pin. After that night, under the pillow of every patient who died there was always one. Sometime later I left that clinic, but I learned they closed the intensive care unit because the nurses were too afraid and no longer wanted to work there. When I was at a rural clinic one night, I was examining a patient in my office. The door was naturally closed when suddenly I heard a noise outside where the nurse's desk was, about 5 meters from my door. Nothing strange, really, because the clinic's front door was open for ventilation. It was about 32 degrees Celsius at the time. I thought maybe someone walked by the path or something. The next day a surveyor from a government agency passed and we chatted for a few minutes, and during the conversation he said, "I see you work a lot here." In fact, we passed by last night in the early morning and we saw the door open and a person sitting at the desk. I swear I froze because at no time during the night was anyone sitting there. "Maybe you confused it with a filing cabinet or something," I told him. I was trying to make sense of it. No, it was right here. And when we passed your door, your office door was closed. We thought you were with a patient and someone else was waiting." I knew that hadn't happened. That night, after turning everything off, I went to my room to sleep. We had to stay at the clinic during our social service. We practically lived there, and during the nights I heard knocks outside and chairs being moved slowly. I couldn't sleep for fear and I had to stay there 6 months, always hearing those noises, but luckily I never saw anything else. I'm a psychiatrist and during my training I worked for 6 months on a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building that had housed psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor we had 13 beds, a nursing station, a lounge, and some meeting rooms. One day I was interviewing a patient and when I asked about sleep patterns she told me she had been hearing a baby crying at night and that it woke her up. There were no children in that hospital because it was located far from residential areas and visiting hours were restricted. After that the nurse spoke to me and told me that the baby crying wasn't a psychotic symptom. She was very serious about it but didn't give more details. I shrugged because it didn't change the diagnosis or treatment. About 3 months into my stay I was sitting at the nurses' station and 3 nurses were behind me talking. I heard one say, "It's very active today," and another replied, "Really?" Oh no, I hadn't noticed. I turned and asked who they were talking about. They looked at each other and then one hesitantly said, "Well, there's a baby here who sometimes cries." Of course I said no, but they just smiled. A few minutes later, however, I heard it. It sounded far but not too far. It was a cry, clearly a baby's cry. It sounded as if it were separated from me by 2 or 3 walls. I was puzzled and when I looked at the nurses they looked at me with a "told you so" expression. I asked them about it, but they couldn't tell me much, only that the crying had always been there. Since then I heard it maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I told a new doctor, who laughed, but a week into her stay she came to me white and told me she had heard it during her break. I no longer work there, I was transferred. But I still think about it sometimes, and I really don't know what that crying was. My wife is a clinical doctor, and she told me a strange experience. Some time ago, an 18-year-old girl was admitted to the intensive care unit. They sent her there because they didn't know what to do with her. Apparently, strange things had started happening to her, according to her relatives. It began when she was in bed with her boyfriend and she started shouting at something by the door to leave. Her boyfriend asked what was wrong, and she said a creepy black figure was standing at the door watching her. He said the door was empty, but she insisted there was someone or something there. She eventually fell asleep or calmed down, but she stayed disturbed for a while. After that, stranger things began to happen. She worked as a waitress, and her coworkers said that sometimes she would just stare at them as if she didn't understand what they were saying. Things got worse quickly until one day, at her mother's house, she began screaming, laughing, and talking about demons in hell. Not knowing what to do, they took her to the hospital. The doctors didn't know how to handle her, so they put her in the ICU for more privacy and to minimize harm to others. My wife had a colleague who was very religious, and he commented that when he heard the young woman speak, he recognized that her ramblings were taken from revelations or sacred writings. They had to strap her to the bed, and she always tried to free herself. She even began to pretend to be normal to convince the nurses to loosen her restraints, and once they did, she would start ranting again. The final diagnosis was a psychological episode. Because it was a public hospital, they couldn't bring a priest in, but all the nurses told the family to take her to church. In the end, she was discharged. I don't know under what conditions, but her family did take her to church. As far as I know, she recovered and is much better now. That was one of several experiences my wife told me that had occurred in a hospital. I'm a hospital doctor in Colorado, and I have 2 experiences to tell. First, the hospital has a large burn unit. A Native American man arrived and stayed in that room for several months. I don't remember how he was burned, but about 75% of his body was burned. Keep in mind, those burns have to be cleaned every day, and then he went to surgery every few days for debridement. It's horrible and not something I want to be part of. Anyway, this man finally died after months of that torture. Not long after, strange things happened in that unit that I personally witnessed. The lights would turn off and on by themselves. The TV would suddenly turn up full volume and couldn't be turned off. The phone would ring, and when you answered, there was static on the other end. Nurses said that when they entered the unit, they would hear someone call their names. Each patient in that room said they had seen a Native American man walking at night. The situation got so bad that the hospital administrators called a shaman from the same tribe as that man to cleanse the room. They held a ceremony, and, incredibly, after that nothing strange happened again. The next experience scared me the most. I was working at a different hospital, an old one that had been expanded and some rooms remodeled. One night I went to sleep in the on-call room that used to be the intensive care room. I was dozing in a chair around 5 in the morning. The nurses sometimes stuck their heads into the room, so I blocked the door with a trash can so they wouldn't bother me. I was falling asleep when I suddenly heard the door start to open and I could hear someone come in. I thought it was my colleague, but he was supposed to be relieving me. For some reason I sensed it was a woman. I heard this person walk toward where I was. I pretended to be asleep. Then I noticed someone bending over and they hissed in my ear. It was such an irritating sound that I shook to wake up and I was scared, but when I looked around there was no one. The thing that frightened me most was that when I turned on the lights, the door was exactly as I had left it, completely closed and blocked by the trash can. I never slept there again. Hospitals are strange places. Almost everyone who works nights has at least one story to tell, but they rarely tell them because it makes them seem paranoid or even crazy.